When Skyward Sword released back in 2011, I had a chance to play through the game, but I only managed to get through the first 3 dungeons before dropping the game for good. I didn't dislike the game, nor did I get stuck at some difficult puzzle. As a matter of fact, I loved the game. The issue was the timing of its release. You see, my birthday, it's in December, and as a teenager in 2011, I got Skyward Sword for my birthday, and I played it for a week, but then Christmas happened. And on Christmas morning, underneath the Christmas tree, was a brand spanking new Nintendo 3DS. All of my friends had had a 3DS since earlier in the year, and I was dying to get my hands on one. It instantly became one of my favorite Nintendo handhelds, and sadly for Skyward Sword, my intention entirely shifted away from it, and I never picked it up again. Now, almost 10 years later, with the release of Skyward Sword HD, I finally had a chance to go back and beat the game that I once started. I always thought that Skyward Sword was a good game, but it was always towards the bottom of my Legend of Zelda favorite games list. But boy was I wrong, because it's an absolutely amazing Legend of Zelda game. My name is Nate the Great, and today I'm going to be reviewing Skyward Sword HD for the Nintendo Switch. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Skyward Sword HD. And without further ado, let's hop right into the review. First off, I want to talk about one of the features that Nintendo has touted as being a definitive feature of this release: the controls. Now, I first started off playing Skyward Sword with just motion controls. There's a certain charm to them that really does make you feel like a hero slashing down enemies when you're moving your Joy-Con through the air. However, sometimes motion controls, they're not the most accessible, and I found myself having to reset the motion control pointer almost constantly. And so when my TV got taken over and I had to switch to handheld mode, I jumped on the opportunity to try out the button controls. Now, at first, I didn't like the button controls. Using the camera can be a little bit wacky, and I kept wanting to press the A or B button to swing my sword. But after a while, I got used to the controls, and as a matter of fact, I preferred them to the original control scheme. The button controls make the game a ton easier. It's pretty obvious that the game was designed with motion controls, as many of the enemies can be taken down in a matter of seconds if you just swing that right analog stick back and forth as fast as you can. Now, the game did have some issues with the button controls. If I started swinging my sword too fast, the game would just stop registering sword swings. I'd have to wait a moment and then resume before I could start swinging my sword again. This became an issue during some boss fights, but luckily it didn't come up too often. Overall, I'd say that the button controls are a welcome and much needed addition to the game. Along with the addition of the new controlled scheme is the HD graphics. Skyward Sword HD looks absolutely beautiful. It amazes me that Nintendo can essentially take a 10-year-old Wii game, do some graphical upscaling, and produce a product that looks better than many games that release today. Many of the textures and models have been updated and improved, and in particular, Link's model has been improved in a way that might make him look like the best looking Link in the entire series. When I think of Link, I think of Skyward Sword's Link. Now, the characters in this game, they're honestly pretty great for a Zelda game. I love that Link and Zelda are childhood friends, and Zelda feels like one of the most spunky and fun incarnations of the character. She also has one of the most unique designs, and I love that she's technically not a princess in this game. Groose is another great character who goes from being this kind of weird, prideful jerk almost to becoming a hero in his own way. I'd love to see him pop up again in future games. Now, in terms of your companion, Fi, I'd say she's alright. I like her design, and I love that she's essentially the spirit of the Master Sword, and she resides within it. It makes me wonder if she might pop up again in a future Legend of Zelda game. One fantastic addition that Skyward Sword HD brings is making Fi's advice optional. It always made me chuckle a little bit when I would start to see my sword light up, and I would just completely ignore it because I didn't want any hints. I wanted to make it through the dungeons on my own. This feature, along with skippable cutscenes, faster text, really trim away a lot of the fat that this game used to have, and make it a smooth, streamlined experience. Overall, Skyward Sword HD has done a great job at making what was once an annoying companion into a pretty great one. Now, one of the things that makes the characters in Skyward Sword great is the setting. The setting of Skyward Sword essentially takes the bright, vibrant colors of Wind Waker and meshes those with the more gritty, realistic style of Twilight Princess to make a pretty magical setting. And that setting is amplified by the many amazing locations and unique dungeons spread throughout the world. One of the reasons why I never picked Skyward Sword back up again was that my friend told me that the game only had 3 locations. And since I had already been to those 3 locations, I didn't really see a need to go back through and backtrack and redo it because I thought that'd be kinda lame. But I was completely wrong. The 3 areas are unique and varied and essentially take interesting gameplay concepts and realize them to their fullest potential. This is definitely a case of quality over quantity in terms of the areas that you explore. Skyward Sword has some of the best dungeons out of the entire Legend of Zelda series. It starts off fairly simple and generic, but the dungeons get more varied and unique over time. In particular, I love the mining facility, the ancient cistern, and the sand ship. The other dungeons of the game, they're okay, but this set of 3 dungeons highlight the best dungeons the series has to offer. The mining facility is innovative, the ancient cistern is beautiful, and the sand ship is just plain fun. Both the mining facility and the sand ship utilize one of the coolest gameplay features in Skyward Sword, time shift stones. Now, normally when I think of time travel in a game, I think of everything going back in time and the whole world changing. But that's not the case with the time shift stones. They essentially allow you to take a glimpse into the past and see what once was, but they only turn back time for the small area around the stone. Enemies who have long since died are revived only for you to take them out again. Areas that have broken down or are filled with sand get fixed as the clock is turned back. My favorite use of this feature was in the desert's sand sea. There you ride on a boat that carries a time stone, and the area that surrounds the boat is thousands of years in the past and shows you that the hot desert was once a sea. Surrounding your boat is this circle of water, but outside of that circle is the harsh desert. To me, the sand sea portion of the game can only be described as absolutely magical. The time shift stones are honestly one of my favorite gimmicks in the entire Legend of Zelda series. Now, nestled between the mining facility and the sand ship is the ancient cistern. This dungeon is so cool. It's clearly inspired by South Asian culture, and it's just beautiful to explore. There's this giant statue in the middle that you're trying to climb up, and it's surrounded by water and lily pads. The dungeon gave me vibes and peace and tranquility, and to top it off, it has one of my favorite bosses in the entire game. They are essentially this mechanical being that your weapons can't scratch. But by stealing their weapons, you can actually deal damage to them. It was so fun to grab the ancient automaton's giant sword and just start whacking away at them so that they would fall down. These 3 dungeons are absolutely amazing, and they feature in what I would call the first and second act of Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is essentially divided into 3 acts, and in between each of these acts you can go to Skyloft and go on side quests. I liked Skyloft and exploring the floating islands, and riding around on your Loftwing can be a lot of fun, especially with the new button controls, but sometimes getting from one area to the next can be a little bit too long. However, the acts themselves are really good. Now, out of the 3 acts, the first part features 3 dungeons and a quest to find Zelda. The second part features a quest to forge the Master Sword, and sees you tracking down the sacred flames across 3 dungeons to do so. The ancient cistern and the sand ship happen to feature in this part, which is one of the reasons why I think it's the best. But it also features the Silent Realms, mini trials in an alternate version of each area where you are stripped of all of your items, including your sword, and have to collect teardrops scattered throughout the area. The catch is that there's these beings called guardians that are trying to chase after you and slash you down. However, they won't chase after you for a set amount of time after you collect each teardrop. But if your timer runs out or you run into a zone that depletes that timer, they wake up and they start relentlessly chasing you. The music gets intense when they both wake up, and the setting changes from this peaceful blue color to a daunting red. There is both a thrill and immense amount of fear and anxiety that comes from this. Mapping out your course from one drop to the next and being stealthy about it is a ton of fun. But in one particular instance, during the trial at Elden Volcano, I ran out of nearby drops and had to track all the way back across the area and to the top of the volcano. I ran out of time just at the foot of the volcano and had to be narrowly dodging attacks before finally securing the last drop. Needless to say, my heart rate was quite elevated during this time. Had I been even hit once, I would have had to restart the whole trial, but luckily I finished just in the nick of time. Hence, I think that most people will probably have a love-hate relationship with these trials because of how stressful they can be. Now that's the majority of the second act of the game. The third act is a little bit lamer than this one, and it's the quest for the Song of the Hero and the Triforce. The quest for the Song of the Hero really just feels like some glorified side quest. You have to revisit all 3 areas again, but this time things have only slightly changed. In the first area, it's now been flooded, and you have to collect these things called tad tones. Tad tones are essentially musical notes that make up that area's part of the song of the hero, and there's a ton of them, and you have to swim to get them. Swimming in Skyward Sword is not very good, and hence this portion of the quest really drags. I honestly did not have a lot of fun doing this portion of the quest. Now, the other 2 portions of the quest are a little bit better. One is basically another stealth segment, somewhat similar to the Silent Realms, and the last is a pretty fun fetch quest. These little 3 quests do slow down the pace of the game, and I wonder how the game would have played out if they were delegated to a side quest instead of being mandatory. After completing the Song of the Hero, you finally end up at the last dungeon. It feels to me like this final dungeon is a celebration of the game's earlier dungeons. Each area in the final dungeon is themed after one of the previous dungeons you've already been to. There's no new or exciting ideas here, but the dungeon itself is very well executed. However, when the final dungeon is complete, that's when the game starts to get really good and really intense. The final boss feels like a mixture of Hyrule Warriors, a celebration of motion controls, and one of the most intense and cinematic fights ever created. It really is a nice finish to a really good game, and fighting that final boss Demise and his minions is a ton of fun. In a post-Breath of the Wild world, it's hard to see Nintendo going back to the linear dungeon-focused design of earlier Zelda games. But Skyward Sword makes me hope for a time in the future when Nintendo will return to the linear-based format of Zelda's earlier games. Skyward Sword HD revives for me a game that I thought I might never play again. It tells the story of the earliest game in the Zelda timeline and does a fantastic job at doing it. Skyward Sword HD is remarkable at bringing out the best in this game, making it a streamlined experience that shows you how well it has done at crafting puzzles and experiences that withstand the test of time, and left me smiling throughout my entire playthrough.